Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz author Carolyn Brewer. She writes a vital piece of jazz history about two Kansas City women, Carol and Dianne, that got the support of jazz luminaries like Marian McPartland and Leonard to launch the Kansas City Women's Jazz Festival. Over the years, it built plenty of steam and had seminal performances by Betty Carter, Mary Lou Williams, the all-star band of women, Toshiko Akiyoshi's band, plus dozens of Kansas City musicians and volunteers that made it go. It's an era and movement that needed to be brought to the forefront, and Carolyn talks about it at length and how she got this to fruition. So get to know her and dig this very important story, my friends.
Thank you for taking a minute out to talk about this book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's one of those chapters in the annals of not only Kansas City jazz, but in jazz overall that I don't think the public really understands what kind of positive momentum it created for the entire genre.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It really has sort of been buried, and the fact that it not only propelled women in jazz forward, but seemed to also be a pretty positive moment for women's rights in general, just people's rights in general.
Sure. Well, let's pick this apart a little bit, and let me ask you this. Based on your lineage and your interest in jazz, where did you grow up and how did you get interested in jazz?
Well, I grew up here in Kansas City. I'm actually an orchestral clarinetist. I don't play jazz at all, but my father was a jazz pianist. My brother is a jazz trombonist who's worked with, he traveled with Jerry Mulligan and Lou Rawls and Diana Ross. Actually, he even did a tour with her, and has been a jazz educator for a long time. My husband's a jazz bassist, and both of our sons are jazz players, so
wow.
I've certainly been surrounded by it, but I'm on the classical side.
Okay. Let me ask you this, from just kind of a pedestrian standpoint of enjoying jazz, who do you enjoy the most? What artists, what albums do you enjoy the most?
Oh, boy, that's a tough one, because it changes all the time. I tend to gravitate towards big bands still. I mean, I love the small groups too, but I really like modern big bands. And by modern, I guess I mean like the kind of big band revival from the 80s and 90s, and even a lot of things that are going on now. My husband plays in a couple of different big bands, and with lots of really interesting arrangements, things that pull influence from not just traditional jazz sources, but use a lot of that conservatory education too, and more complex harmonies and things like that. I still sometimes I'll get on a Miles Davis kick and I'll just listen to nothing but Miles for a couple of months. Of course, when I was working on this book, I was listening to lots of women jazz players or groups that would have women in them. So it kind of changes, but pretty eclectic.
Tell me how this book came about. What was the spark? What was the journey to getting this actually published?
Well, actually, I was doing an interview about the Kansas City Jazz Incorporated Festival that was in Jam Magazine. I was doing an interview with Carol Comer for that, and she said, well, you really ought to be talking to me about the Women's Jazz Festival. And frankly, I'd kind of forgotten about that one. So I said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So that became my next article, and it became very apparent very quickly that trying to condense it all down into about 6 pages for a local magazine wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
I mean, I did that, but, there was so much more, and it deserved so much more attention. So that was kind of the impetus. And just having access to interviews with Carol, Comer and Dianne Gregg, the founders, they live about 2 miles away from me. That was a huge help, having them as first resources. So 5 years later, here I am.
Wonderful. So going into this, you probably had some conception of what you might run into, but what were the most surprising things that you learned about this festival and digging into this that you had no idea about?
Well, I think I probably just thought of them as sort of surface festivals where people would go and enjoy themselves and hear some great music and come away inspired, but I don't think I really understood the depth of connection that people made through these festivals. Being a kind of the first, it was the first women's jazz festival in the world. So being that first-time opportunity for so many players, they really just kind of created their own energy with this. It became something but much bigger than the founders ever dreamed that it would be. It just took on a life of its own. The energy that it produced, and how they drew so many different aspects into it. It wasn't just a concert or jam sessions. It was, there's so many educational opportunities that came out of this. They had the TNT concerts, the Top New Talent concerts, which were to promote kind of underappreciated and new time jazz players and give them a boost up. The fact that it even included a film series. Leonard Feather brought his vintage films to this festival and played them for people. And, of course, this was way before YouTube, so this was the only opportunity people had to see these films. And he lectured about them. So there was a huge educational opportunity right there. They had scholarships. Anytime somebody said, well, how about we do this? How about we add this to the festival? They almost always said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. They had so many different aspects. I didn't understand the depth of involvement that the people had and how much work went into it, actually.
So in 1978, jazz is a pretty male-dominated realm of music, as a lot of music was. And Carol and Dianne come along. How renegade was their idea? Now we look in retrospect, have decades to look back on it. How big was this for them to further, the advancement of women in jazz and just to have more of a diversity on the stage?
Well, Dianne had a radio show on KCUR, the NPR station here, called Women in Jazz. And so she had interviewed a lot of jazz players who were women and knew the scope of talent out there. But she also knew that they weren't getting heard. It really was kind of I think that the biggest innovative thing was that they created a place where all of that could come together. There obviously had been women jazz musicians since the form was first started, but there wasn't any kind of a cohesive oasis sort of for them to come and explore their playing opportunities and getting to talk to different people and network. First thing Carol and Dianne did after they had this idea, and that's another thing, it wasn't a corporate idea, it wasn't business leaders deciding they wanted to increase revenue in the city. It wasn't a school or an arts organization trying to promote themselves with concerts. It wasn't the mayor's idea. It was just the idea of two women who thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if there was a women's jazz festival? And then they took off that. The very first thing that they did was to call Marian McPartland and ask her what she thought of it. Because, of course, Marian knew everybody and had been around for a long time. And her response was immediate and was, why didn't I think of that? That's a great idea. I'll do anything I can to help. So that kind of gave them the backbone to the whole thing to realize that, well, if Marian thinks it's a good idea, it must be a good idea.
So what was the jazz scene like in the late 70s and the 80s in Kansas City? What kind of environment was going on to either foster or maybe this bolstered it?
Well, I think, Kansas City is kind of a unique place because of the history. But I think sometimes we've kind of ridden on that history thinking, well, we were a big deal in the 20s and 30s, but then things kind of calmed down. Well, but in the late 70s in particular, it was kind of in flux. I think jazz is frequently in flux, but it was in flux because you kind of had the disco scene coming on. I talked to lots of local players who said that they'd had steady, 5-night-a-week gigs all through the 70s at various country clubs or just clubs. But by 78 or so, things were changing because people wanted disco instead of jazz. And a lot of what they were playing wasn't strict jazz. Jam sessions is where the jazz really happened. But a lot of times there'd be like a trio that would maybe play 2 or 3 tunes, and then the singer would come out, and then they'd do just kind of jazz arrangements of pop tunes. And maybe the band would get to do another tune or two per night that was just them. But mostly it was singers with jazz quartets or trios behind them. So that was pretty established, but then when disco started coming in, the club owners decided it would, that's the direction that they wanted to go. So a lot of those people didn't end up having the steady work anymore. So it was kind of a transitional time, and that also made Carol and Dianne nervous. And of course, they formed a board of directors right away. So everybody on the board kind of had that worry that, are people still going to want to listen to this? But of course, they did. So that was good. But kind of a tenuous time. Plus, there was a whole new generation. The baby boomer generation was really coming into its own as far as planes goes. And they had the benefit of being able to still sit in with some of the jazz masters from before. I mean, there were still places they could go and play with Jay McShann, sit in with Jay McShann someplace. There was an awful lot of learning that went through those jam sessions. People told me that they would go purposely just to get to pick the brain and hear the musical education that they could get from just sitting in with some of these players. But they also had the benefit of more structuralized jazz education because more of the schools were having that, and of course then colleges were having jazz programs too. So you kind of had the best of both worlds, but then there weren't as many places to play. So
let me ask you this. Through the history of the Jazz Festival, the first year it makes no money. You eventually evolved to a point where Mary Lou Williams is coming in, Marilyn Mays, Jimmy Carter congratulates the founders, and things just kind of, they start taking off. Talk to me a little bit about the evolution of this festival, how it started out small and how it got big, and how you see it as an author of a book that really looked at this in a macro sense.
Well, it did only start off with just the main concert, which was always on Sunday nights. And then they had jam sessions, of course. You couldn't have anything happen in Kansas City without a jam session. And then a couple of clinics. But then, as I mentioned before, people would say, well, what about having some scholarships? Or what about having a special night of just focusing on new talent? And so everything just kind of built from there. It seemed like there was plenty of energy and plenty of willingness and volunteers to take these things further. And I think word of mouth had a lot to do with it as far as getting people. They had people literally from all over the country that would come to this. In fact, they also had performers from Scandinavia and Poland.
Wow.
I'm not sure why those two places, but that was, it was a big thing there. I think just the momentum of having this happen every year and people looking forward to it. Sometimes bands would even form just for the opportunity to audition to be on the concert. For the TNT part, at least, it was all by audition. They had to send in tapes, and the board had to evaluate them. It wasn't anybody who asked. So that was a big part of it. They also had the educational, they had bands from junior high on through college that performed, and that was invaluable because not only did they get the opportunity to play in a nice venue, they also got the opportunity to mingle with some of the headliners. They got to jam with some of them. They got to benefit from going to their clinic. It was educating people on all different levels. And this just kept continuing. It just kept getting bigger and bigger. And in fact, it almost got too big. It was becoming harder and harder to manage all that.
The one thing, too, I noticed towards the end of the festivals, the 1985, do you find it anything interesting at all that cities tend to kind of ebb and flow, and that was the year the Royals won the championship, that there was a lot of fervor going on in Kansas City? Is there anything corollary to you about the significance of the last year being 85?
I hadn't really made that connection with the Royals, but yeah, that's right. No, I think it just got to be a whole lot of work. A couple of years before that, Carolyn and Dianne had kind of stepped back from it and said, we still will be every bit as supportive as ever, and we will do whatever anybody wants us to do, but we don't want to be running the whole thing. And when other people took over and realized, wow, this is pretty much a 12-month job, they kind of decided maybe that wasn't something that they wanted to do. So it just kind of died of natural causes. I know there's still talk about reviving the Women's Jazz Festival and certainly jazz festivals in general. But I think it was volunteer burnout was a lot of what ended it. There were other festivals that were coming up at that time, and probably different civic leaders felt like that there wasn't as much of a void. And of course, the initial reaction to this whole thing was that they didn't want it to always be just a women's jazz festival. They wanted to get to the point where it was seen as just a jazz festival that included women musicians. That the musicians just happened to be women, so that it wasn't, it wasn't segregating it like that. That happened to some extent, probably not to the extent that the founders had wanted it to, but that was all part of it too. That there were other festivals that were becoming more prevalent at that time.
So at the end of the day, this jazz festival takes place successfully in a jazz town, really promoting the plight of, just a lot of players that probably wouldn't have gotten recognized as widely as they would have. At the end of the day, what did this run of festivals do for women in jazz?
Well, if nothing else, it certainly gave them the impetus to continue. It gave them a network of people to contact. One of the things that the festival organizers did was to put together a directory of women in jazz, so that people would have this as a resource, to contact people from other cities. It was an oasis. It was a place where they could go and they could play, and they could play on the jam sessions. They could audition to be one of the performing groups. It just gave them such an opportunity, and that really stuck with people and really gave them the impetus to go on or to go study somewhere else. It told them that it was okay, that yes, you're going to have moments where you may have a more difficult time getting paid, or what you're asked to wear, it may not be something that you would choose on your own, or, there's still going to be those remnants of discrimination or just attitudes that aren't all that healthy. That proved to them that they could do it, and that there were plenty of other women out there that were willing to do that too. So even though, I'm still almost 40 years later, I'm running into people all the time that say, yeah, I went to those festivals and that really got me playing. That really, I sat in a jam session and that proved to me that I could do that, and so I just kept playing.
So let's say someone's in a bookstore. They're either a novice or somebody that's really entrenched in the history of jazz, and they pick your book up. Why should they read it? What is significant about your book that is very key, not only to Kansas City, but in the history of jazz?
Just because it was the very first women's jazz festival. There were others that followed even that summer. There were a couple of others, but it was the first one, and it was the one that was the forerunner of the whole thing, that really showed women that they could do this. And, there's books about women jazz players, interviews with them or backgrounds on them, but this kind of shows what happens when you put all of these people together and let them create their own thing. That they were given the space and the opportunity, but what they turned it into became something completely unique to that situation.
Wonderful. I think that's a great way to wrap everything up. Carolyn, thank you for taking some time out. Thank you for the book. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Carolyn for her book, her history, and time. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.